And now to our top story, as thousands of people living in high-rise buildings with unsafe cladding have been promised by the government that they won't have to pay to remove it. The Housing Secretary announced that he's more than trebling the funds that will go towards bills faced by leaseholders who've been unable to sell, remortgage or insure their homes. But what does the opposition think? The Shadow Housing Secretary, Thangam Debbonaire, joins me now. Hello to you, Thangam Debbonaire. £5 billion in total. It's a huge sum of money.
Well, actually, only 3.5 billion of that is new. And unfortunately, 3.5 years on from Grenfell, this just feels like another very piecemeal solution, hasn't dealt with the problems. And unfortunately, this is because this comes on a 3-year record of failure from this government. They still don't know how many unsafe buildings there are. They still aren't taking into account the other fire risks. It isn't just about cladding. And even the funding that was promised last year, £9 out of 10 hasn't actually got out the door to those who need it. So unfortunately, this government has promised leaseholders 17 times that they wouldn't have to pay. And they've rode back on that promise today. Leaseholders will have been watching and they have been bitterly disappointed. And there's also in this plan today, there's no deadline. There's no word of when homes are going to be saved. I asked the Secretary of State specific questions. I asked him to say how much he thought this was going to, how much the new levy would bring in. He didn't say. I asked him when the deadline was. He wouldn't say. I asked him how much leaseholders would be paying, and he wouldn't say. There's too many unanswered questions, which leaves leaseholders still in danger, in fear, and in the dark about what's going to happen to them.
The Housing Secretary described this as fair and generous to leaseholders. Let's just be clear on who is affected here. Leaseholders in high-rise buildings with ACM cladding, that is what's deemed the most dangerous cladding, are going to face no costs. Those are buildings 18 metres or higher. Here we are, Thangam Debbonaire. Sorry, we just lost you momentarily. But those who are in buildings below 18 metres will get loans.
Yes, and the government promised that leaseholders wouldn't have to pay. A loan is a loan. It's also, I think it's a bit disingenuous of the government not to be clear about what is covered. So whatever height your building is, it's not clear whether or not things like fire breaks and fire doors are going to be covered. And that's what many people have been left paying for and being threatened with massive charges. There are still too many people who are in homes without unsafe cladding, but with other fire difficulties, who are facing bills of up to £100,000. You know, in many cases, that will be half the value of their property. And unfortunately, there have been fires in buildings under 18 metres. Just last year, there was one in Crewe, in a care home, where 150 older and vulnerable people were left homeless. So just having this 18 metres just doesn't cut it. There's people I've come across, like a woman in Runcorn, for instance, who's living in a development where there is a mixture of buildings. Hers is just under 18 metres, she won't be covered. And just next door to her, there's one that's over 18 metres who will. This seems to be really arbitrary, really unfair and unjust.
Yeah, what about the levy for developers in the future? Do you think that will act as a deterrent?
Well, I'm hoping that this is the government serious about making sure that those who bear responsibility for the crisis do bear the cost, because the taxpayer also isn't responsible. And I think that's a very important point, that neither the leaseholder nor the taxpayer should be left with that burden. So I'm glad that the government has taken heed of what Labour said to them over the last few weeks, and also campaigners as well, who've been doing a brilliant job, having to deal with their own heartache and still campaigning. But the devil is unfortunately in the detail. I think they needed to explain this afternoon what legal action they will be taking against anyone who's responsible for knowingly putting dangerous cladding on buildings. That wasn't mentioned. And I say this again, the loan scheme is a betrayal of their promise to leaseholders. And I say to leaseholders, we're not giving up on you. We will keep fighting.
Robert Jenrick said that your request for a task force, your offer of setting up a task force, was empty words. And meanwhile, the Prime Minister had been working with lenders and insurers to bring forward today's announcement. Does it give any comfort then that something is happening, some progress is happening 3.5 years on for those who are living in these situations?
Something is still something, but it's 3.5 years on. It's after 3.5 years of being too slow, being late, failing to get a grip on this. Yes, they may be talking to lenders, but why weren't they talking to lenders 3 years ago? Why weren't they talking to the experts 3 years ago? And the suggestion of a task force, I don't think he was listening carefully. The task force was one that we proposed to have teeth, to have powers, to take out the party politics, which, by the way, I think leaseholders would really welcome. Take the party politics out, but create a task force that's actually got teeth, powers to enforce building remedy, powers to get the funding out the door as quickly as possible, powers to make sure that that money goes according to risk. At the moment, we risk the situation that we've got with the previous fund, which will be first come, first served, rather than those that are the riskiest. There are other models that the government could have been looking at. I've also been talking to the finance industry and the insurance industry, and I'm afraid to say I think this is too little too late for many, many people, including some who have already gone bankrupt and lost their homes because of this crisis. It's absolutely heartbreaking.
Thangam Debbonaire, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this afternoon.